Up next, we react to the wild Netflix documentary Jerry Springer Fights Camera Action. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man who's definitely got a story to tell. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to hypnotize us with some of your insights today?
Yeah, let's go. I was trying to think about when you said hypnotize. I'm thinking about Biggie, and I'm thinking, what can I pull out that song? But
I would say, that was intended to evoke that. Yes, yeah.
Yes, and my mind's not sharp enough at middle age that I can pull it off well. So here we are.
Hopefully but your takes are better prepared than that.
Yeah, no, they'll slowly come out. You got me. You just put me on the spot too fast. It's a warm up.
Yeah, that was a practice point.
I'm old enough and comfortable enough in my old self that I can acknowledge that I'm not that fast on my feet anymore.
Yeah,
I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed.
We're recording this on January 14th, 2025. And last week, January 7th, Netflix released a documentary about the Jerry Springer talk show, which was one of the more popular daytime talk shows on television from the mid 1990s through the early 2000s. Now, the documentary took us behind the scenes and in the heads of some of the key people involved in making it, and made some interesting connections between between the show and how our culture has evolved since then. So to get us started, Tunde, what did you take away from what they showed about how the show was made, and also how it evolved from really a pretty bland offering when it started to being the crazy spectacle that it became?
Yeah, this was a great documentary because it's not only did it take me back to kind of a little bit of nostalgia from the younger days of my life. It was a great reminder, kind of the way you set it up. And they used some of this terminology in the documentary, which was the origination of American shock TV. And, maybe someone could point to a show before that was a little bit crazy too. But this one, I think, was what mainstreamed this I like that term, shock TV.
Yeah.
And it kind of,
yeah, if anything was shocking before, it wasn't as shocking as this because people were shocked.
Yeah, exactly. And the way that Jerry Springer, the show itself, became kind of a cultural thing, that's what I mean. It wasn't just like a one shocking show. It was the constant shock. And I think what's interesting is once you get in, I think the documentary did a good job, and this is where it was interesting to contrast to some of the cultural twists and turns that we've taken as a nation since that show's come out, in the last 30 years. And I think one of the things that I felt in watching it and just being reminded was that once you get into this kind of shock value, a way of entertainment, you always have to ratchet it up. And and that's, I guess it's kind of like, that old thing with the Romans, with the gladiators and all that, like, they kept having to do more and more spectacular things to please the crowd. And I feel like that's kind of the era we're in now with media. And I feel like this documentary did such a good job of, like I said, maybe Jerry Springer as a show didn't start this by themselves, but just as a cultural kind of marker on the roadmap of our journey as Americans. Let's put it that way, if I can be that eloquent.
Well, it mainlined it.
I feel like it's a big road marker. Yeah.
Yeah. It made it a part of like normal culture, so to speak. Like it mainlined it. And I mean, I think your allusion to the Roman Colosseum kind of thing is like, it's like, when you first start having people fighting lions and stuff like that, it's amazing. But then after you're doing that for like 6 months, it's like, this is boring, so you got to have something
we got to
else
throw some people in there, let them get eaten.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, it definitely creates this, like once shock becomes the currency, so to speak, maintaining shock means you have to keep ratcheting it up. Like that's kind of the way that works. And that's not the way with everything, like that's like comedy can be comedy. It doesn't have to be crazy and crazy. As long as you can tell funny jokes, you can tell funny jokes. And that can, the jokes can't be the same, but you can recycle that without having to keep escalating things. And so that's an interesting point. And I think a good point about the way that you trade on the currency of shock. But what stood out to me, actually, the initial thing, as you get in the first 30 minutes, or it's a two-part, each part's about 50 minutes or something like that. And was that the people who drove the change from this mundane talk show, hey, like you're excited, you're scared to go to college or yada yada yada, to this spectacle, were tabloid people who came from the tabloid industry. Which if you're in the tabloid industry, your job literally is, and particularly the people who are putting the headlines together and stuff, is you have somebody who's walking by and taking a glance in a grocery store, in the checkout aisle. They're just taking a glance at these things. You have to try to get their attention just with a glance. And so it makes sense that those people would bring this mentality of, hey, we want people, if they see a piece of this, they're going to want to know more about it. So, but that came from the tabloid industry. And it made me wonder, like, okay, so do tabloid people really have a pulse on the way, on what humans respond to more than other people, really? Like, because there's such a bottom line kind of at its core, how can we get somebody to take a second look? And they distill it down. And so ultimately they brought all of that kind of sensibility to television. And as you point, it's not going to leave now. Like once it was brought there, then it's like, okay, well, how can we one up the Jerry Springer show? Or how can we, and so everything becomes about, we have this mentality of how can we get enough of intrigue off of a glance to bring someone in and then to capture their attention, capture their eyeballs, so to speak. And yeah, that this came from people in the tabloid industry, I thought was very insightful, because we all acknowledge and understand, like, yes, the tabloid people, they're not trafficking in truth and fact. They're trafficking in what can they say? My wife married Bigfoot or something. Like, what can they say on a headline that'll get you to look and ideally get you to pick it up for a few minutes? But it's really not something you're going to spend deep reflection on either. It's like, hey, boom, this is going to be something that I see that is crazy, and then I'm going to put it down. Yeah.
No, it's a great point. And I think, that's really it. It's I think the medium, what I'm learning, I mean, that book was so right and spot on, the amusing ourselves to death, that the medium does just influence our culture. And by medium, I mean the way that information is disseminated. So to your point, when the tabloid is on the grocery store shelf, a person, first of all, is seeing that for a short period of time. Then if they want to continue to see it, they have to choose to purchase it, take it home, and then they go in their living room and see it. And you're right, the percentage of people that do that is much smaller. And then
and even if they do that, they're still spending 5-10 minutes with it, and that's it. It's not,
and it's
static, reread it 30 times, and but go ahead.
But then with the proliferation of our technology, right, by the 90s, you had satellite TV, you had the explosion of all these channels. Because remember, when you and I were kids in the 80s, cable TV might have had, 50, 60 channels. By the 90s, I remember this when you had HBO 1, 2, and 3, and you had all these, that's when you started having like DirecTV with literally 1,000 channels. And you had all these different broadcasts and networks and networks that have 17 different channels. So they're playing, it's not just Jerry Springer 1 hour of the show. They're playing Jerry Springer, Ricky Lake, Sally Jesse Raphael, all the shows at the time that were trying to compete for eyeballs. And what were they doing? Jerry Springer may have been the most aggressive of them, but the Sally Jesse's and the Ricky Lakes still had people behaving in ways that I think most of us would look back at those shows and say, yeah, that was a little bit unbecoming. They're all doing the shock value thing. And then to your point, like fast forward now to we're in the full information age, the early 2000s, called the first quarter of the century. And the technology has just leapfrogged from the printing press putting stuff in the grocery lane, aisle where we see it, to then the television, which is in quote unquote our living room or our bedroom, where we kind of get immersed in it a little bit more throughout the day. We can spend hours on it, to now it's in our pocket, in our phone, and the algorithms are conditioned to always kind of have us in this state of heightened anxiety. And the beauty of the documentary is it showed, and that's why I want to throw it back to you, and kind of how the producers did this prior to algorithms, that it was human to human. You know what I mean?
No. And I thought that, like that was something, that was actually something you brought up to me, which I thought was very insightful, was that the role of the producer, and the documentary did a really good job of, like, there were several producers being interviewed on the show, and that these are the people that really, they were where the rubber meets the road. They were the one that got the guests and spoke to the guests, brought them in. And then more importantly, what you may not recognize was they were the one that primed the guests to then go on the show and create the spectacle. So yes, the story, like they made careful. They were saying, hey, these stories are real. They weren't getting people to make up stuff. If they were find out something was made up, they would get rid of it. Like they weren't in the business of coming up with fake stuff. But what they would do is talk to the people, prime the people in a way. I believe that the term that was used at one point is called shaping the missile. So they would get them riled up or tell them, kind of get them ready to say something that they realized was going to set the other person off. And they would basically essentially prime the guests so that they could deliver. Once they got out there, they were all amped up. They were, emotional and everything like that. So they would deliver a spectacle of a show. And the connection that, like I said, that I thought was really insightful that you brought up was like, that's really like the job of a social media algorithm right now. Is that what these producers did? And like, again, this is a large part of the documentary talking about what the producers did, how hard it was on them, because they're constantly trying to amp people up. Like the question, are they manipulating these people, or are they kind of just pushing the right buttons to get them to tell their story, but in a way that's going to deliver more fireworks? It's a really interesting point, though, to kind of think of like that's what the algorithms do to all of us now, basically, is the algorithms based on our browsing history, based on what we look at, how long we look at it and so forth. They know how to prime us. They know how to get us. If we're on, social media app, they know how to get us primed so that we're going to start typing and arguing and stuff like that, because that's going to keep other people more engaged and so forth. So we're all actually the guests on Jerry Springer when it comes to the social media stuff, and the algorithm is the producer that's making us create the spectacle for everybody else to look at. It's kind of wild to make all that connection. But I know I stole
that's why
a little bit, but you kind of set me up to say.
But it's good, because that's one of the reasons why I would recommend people watch this documentary. I mean, obviously we're not being paid by Netflix here to advertise for them, but it's that insightful in this, especially people like around our age or even older, meaning that you remember seeing this stuff, because you can really see how this attitude of exploiting human emotion really and kind of preying on the human spirit.
Age, honestly, man, I think people, even people who whose age wouldn't have them remember when this happened contemporaneously, can still get a lot from seeing this.
Of course, you can get a lot from it. I just mean, for those of us that do remember, it's like it's really a good reminder, because you can remember those days, but then I want to just go back on what you were starting to describe and really go into it, meaning because the documentary shows the production team, the producers, kind of ramping these people up in the green room, where they're like, literally there's a scene, and again, I'm not verbatim, I can not remember it that way, but it's more like
they're practicing, they with the guests. Yeah. And so they're playing the role of the other person or something.
They show it where one of the producers is egging up a lady who's going to be going out on stage, and she's saying, he slept with these two women, and she's kind of, and then they show the lady going out and she's on fire. Like she's ready to go punch somebody. And cause I remember watching the show and seeing the people come out like hot, Yeah. But now you didn't know as a viewer that they're getting like riled up back there by somebody.
They don't just walk around all day like that.
Yeah.
They were actually put in that state. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what I kind of realized when I'm watching. I'm like, hold on. To your point, I'm like, now, instead of just these few people that are guests on a show getting riled up and walking out in front of 100 people audience and all these TV cameras making a fool of themselves because they're so emotionally riled up that they can't stop and think, they're already triggered so much that they just respond. There's no space in between for the brain to say, all right, let me chill out and see what I'm about to do here. And that reminded me that now with technology, again, in the last 25 years, like you just said, we're all guests on the Jerry Springer show in one way or another, because we have phones in our pockets that have on social media and our news feeds, algorithms constantly feeding us stuff that are priming us to want to fight and to be all emotional. And so you could be in the grocery store. And this is why I laugh sometimes when I watch with my kids, the Karen videos on YouTube, like Karen's at the airport, Karen's, at the grocery store. And you sometimes wonder, like, man, so many people are just so pent up. You're in this public place and someone accidentally bumps somebody or something, and they're all just like, oh, what are you doing? You violated my dignity as a human or something. Yeah. And that's what I realized watching the show. I'm like, these algorithms, social media, all this internet stuff is just another layer of the technology allowing some sort of production, entertainment, or company to manipulate us, just like the producers were talking about. And that's a great point you make. The gentleman did use the term shaping the missile. And what he kept saying, and he did this with his finger, I remember, he's like, we want to touch on these certain emotional buttons and triggers. And he just acknowledged that, like, we're gonna be firing these people up. And I'm thinking, now we're all victims of this. And that's a great point you make. We're all guests on the Jerry Springer show now, but that show is now the American life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And everything is now like this. Our politics is all entertainment and it's all shock value. Our discussions about business and that, like, everything that's supposed to be serious.
That's what you started with. Like, once you start getting accustomed to this certain level of shock in what you consume, it's needed actually to even get you to turn away, like even to get you to look. Like, our politicians will behave in a certain way because that's the only way that's going to get you to pay attention. Or, our Real Housewives of this. If they're just out there shopping at groceries or not groceries, department stores or luxury stores and taking trips somewhere, nobody's watching that. But if somebody's throwing a drink on somebody or something like that, it's like, oh, we got to check this out. So we've become the place of, like, the society wide. Like, it's like, okay, yeah, everybody has to keep amping this stuff up. One of the things with there's two other things I want to touch on before we get out of this. One was they did give specific mention about where the guests in the Jerry Springer show came from primarily. The Jerry Springer triangle, so to speak. I want to talk about that. But the other thing I want to talk about, and I want to get to right now, is just this idea of, okay, so we're talking about this shock value and how, people, like, this is how you can get eyeballs and so forth. One piece of the discussion I thought that was missing, and I think should be added, is the idea that there's this question on whether or not this is human nature. So is it human nature when you see these fights that we're gonna run to it and we want to see it and everything like that? Or is it merely just something that people will respond to if given the opportunity to? And I think that this is where we get confused a lot of times, in that the excuse to put anything on television or on social media is just that, hey, this is what people want. And I don't know that that's 100% true. In fact, I think that's a little misleading, because if in the abstract, people don't necessarily clamor for that. What it is, though, it definitely is that people will respond to it. If you give them that, they will respond. But if it's not an option, you won't have people banging down the door. In 1990, you didn't have people banging down the door saying, we want people fighting on television. Like, that wasn't what people weren't clamoring for. That. If that's what people wanted because of their nature, then people would be asking for it, whether it was an option or not. What we see is that once it's made an option, people will respond to it, and then that can be exploited commercially. So what we're observing here isn't just a function of human nature, and this is just what it's going to be. It's a function of a race to the bottom, that we will do anything in order to get your attention. So therefore, we'll pull out anything that people will respond to. Like the executive producer said, hey, I will execute a person on television. Because he's saying there is no limit. I will go to the bottom of the bottom in order to, because people, not that that's what people are clamoring for. That's not what people, quote unquote, independently want, but that's what they will respond to. And that will give me a leg up in getting attention relative to my other competitors if I stoop lower than they do. So I think that's a connection that's not really made, because a lot of times we hear it with social media too. It's just like, oh, well, this is just what people want. If you put this stuff out there, this is what they gravitate towards. And again, it's like, that's not true, because it's not something that they're asking for before you give it to them. It's no different than sugary sweets or something like that. Like, it's not something that people are clamoring for. It's like, but if you give it to them, then they want it. It's like, okay, we're on it. Or, I mean, the example you threw out to me when I talked about this to you was like drugs, like heroin. It's not like people aren't in the street demonstrating because they want more heroin. But if you give them heroin, then their bodies will respond to it, and then they're going to want more of it. But that doesn't mean you should go around giving everybody heroin.
I think honestly, man, this is the dilemma of American culture. I think the tension, let me see how I put this, kind of the tension and the lack of equilibrium, maybe, of our relationship between corporate power and us as the people. And because you said a lot there, which was very good. I think what you've identified, let's say with the food industry, is similar to what we're talking about with what social media, the regular media, like from the Jerry Springer type of show, and our political media, from the various cable networks, and the way that politicians behave on social media, to, again, needing everyone's attention and shock value. They're all very similar. And I feel like the way you just described it is a great, succinct way of showing that the American consumer and the American citizen, in that sense, has been a victim of all this. And because to your point about food, right? Like, that's what I mean. Like, I think most adults in America are somewhat knowledgeable of the fact that fast food isn't that great for you. Fried food isn't that great. I mean, we all kind of heard this stuff, leafy greens are good. But you're right. We're all fighting a battle that's very hard to fight because the food industry, through lobbying, is just allowed to put things, chemicals and flavors and all these things that they know our brains are addicted to. Like,
we will respond to, our bodies will respond to it in ways that we may not even be able to.
You know what? And that's a great word, respond.
Respond is the key term, I think, in this. Yeah. In that it's not that your human nature makes you demand that. People weren't demanding Twinkies before they were invented. But once they were invented and people tasted it and their body responded to it a certain way, then it's like, oh, give me more of that. Give me more.
Yeah. And you're right, because it's a trigger that we can't resist. Like the brain chemistry, meaning we're fighting a battle against scientists in these food companies that actually are shaping the way the new sugar molecule is in some products so it fits in our tongue and, hits our brain a certain way. Like all that research they're doing, and we don't even realize that because it's not on the package, that we're fighting against an army of scientists and psychologists whenever we buy food. And I think it's the same thing with the media, right? Like, these companies are studying how to get our attention, how to disturb us, the things we kind of know now about social media and about how we are triggered by algorithms and bots and all that. And, that's what I mean. It's like we are suffering from a mental health standpoint, physical health standpoint. We're talking about the food and all that. And because our culture doesn't want to have to go and tell corporate America to chill out, because then
we don't know how. We've been conditioned. We don't know how. Because as soon as somebody brings up a way, hey, we got to try to rein this in, they're like, oh, free market, you can't do that. Like we don't even have a mechanism to effectively discuss that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We've been conditioned to believe that trying to rein in anything corporate is basically you're a communist, right? Like there's these extremes. No, seriously, like I either got to be total free market or I'm a total
companies
socialist.
Companies can dump whatever they want, wherever they want. They can put whatever in my food. The logic of this obviously is they don't even have to tell you what's in it, but we won't.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying there seems to be no ability to have a discussion about some sort of healthy middle ground, right? That capitalism is great, but it should be well regulated too. And I think that with the proliferation of the technology, and again, these are things that I think are also very personal, right? Like regulating what information they see and all that, because of a lot of Americans were very individualistic. It's like, all right, well, who are you to tell me what I can watch or not? And I think a lot of things are the messenger. We talk about this with food, right? 10 years ago, we had a first lady who wanted to help Americans get off sugar, and she had a garden in her yard and all that. Today, we have people coming in who want to also help people get healthy.
But get off of processed foods and stuff.
Yeah, but the response of the audience, meaning the public, is very different. It's just because it's two separate messengers. And I think that goes into how we're so fractured by all this stuff. And
that goes into the answer on how corporate America is able to keep us pointing the finger elsewhere other than them in order to try to rein in this type of stuff. I think one of the things I just to draw the connection, the reason why I think it was important that we pointed out that the people who really, who kind of created this direction for the Springer Show were from the tabloid industry is to connect to this, because the tabloid industry were the scientists basically on how to, with a limited window, get and maintain attention. Like they were the ones who had been doing experiments, so to speak, by selling, tabloid magazines, but they had been doing these experiments day after day, week after week for decades. How can we get attention and so forth? And so they were very well versed. What that industry had learned over the past few decades was very well versed. And once it was able to be translated over to television in a different medium, it was able to explode in a different way.
Yep.
But no, I think we can wrap this topic from there. We appreciate everyone for joining us on this episode, or this part of this episode. Check out part 2 as well, and we'll talk to you soon.